Hello everyone, welcome to another shmup topic video. Today's subject has been requested a time or two in the comments section, and so yes, persistence does pay off. And what I want to talk about in this video are my thoughts and views when it comes to shmups and their prices and many pitfalls and problems I've seen around this. This is actually a pretty contentious topic, funnily enough. You think of all the different controversies and issues that come up when you do a review, like my R-Type Final 2 review, where people can get mad about, oh, you don't understand the gameplay, you don't understand the franchise, you don't understand the development team, so on and so forth. But a lot of it does come down to simply disagreeing about whether or not the game's worth the price point. And this is a real problem within video game reviewing in general, especially shmups, but even outside of shmups, this has become a real problem, especially with the new tagline every single review seems to have of, is it worth it? This has become a big pet peeve of mine because yes, I know it's great for your YouTube discoverability and everything like that, but I think it's a real problem in terms of the ethos of what you're trying to ask and what you're trying to answer when you're doing a review, because it's so vague and so subjective as far as, is it worth it? Is it worth it compared to what? Is it worth it in what sense? Is it worth it in the sense of, is it worth your money? Well, you could easily answer that in the greater scheme of things, video games are pretty undervalued, pretty underpriced. So even if a game's bad in the sense of most other games, it could be considered worth it when you look at it historically. You know, like Asteroids. At one point, Asteroids was a super expensive game. Now it would be ridiculous to pay full price for an old Atari game like that unless you're collecting or whatever. So things change when it comes to being, is it worth it or not, right? It's all about context and environment, and that's something that gets really tricky as a reviewer, especially in the sort of ecosystem we have now where games go on sale very frequently, they price drop very quickly, it's very competitive. And so again, in the greater sense, you can always sort of cop out and say, well, sure, I don't recommend the game, but you could pick it up on sale, so then I recommend it. That's something you hear in many reviews over and over, and that's not necessarily a bad thing because I do understand the practicality of that. But in my sense, I don't like to look at reviews like that necessarily unless they have a real obvious pricing problem. Like, let's say for instance they came out with Ketsui Destiny, which I would really strongly recommend, but for whatever reason M2 decided to release that for $300 or $200. At that point, that would be one of those games where it's like, it's a really good game, but we need to wait for this to come on sale because this price is kind of insane. But that's actually a very rare occurrence in the world of shmups. I would say overall shmups tend to be much more undervalued than overvalued. So I haven't actually come across this before where it's a really good game, but I can't justify the price point. And I have actually seen comments over the years as I've done reviews for stuff like Nintendo Life and just on my own channel, where some people certainly feel that the genre of shmups, no matter what you do, never fully justify a full $60 price tag. They like, wait, that's a AAA game price tag. They deserve that money. Whereas a shmup, no matter how many arranges and soundtracks and no matter how excellent of a port it is, like the Shot Triggers team ports, those aren't worth $60 in some people's eyes. Whereas to me, if I were to really realistically sit down and say, what would I pay for these ports as far as absolute payment, like where would I cut that off? I probably would get up into the $100 range for those ports specifically. And this is an interesting part about shmup collecting and shmup playing, because sometimes these are price points you do run into when you get into the more high roller stuff. But I want to begin, before we get to the high roller stuff, begin by talking about the more consumer level stuff, because it's also a little bit more applicable to, I think, most people out there. And so the first thing I want to tackle is this issue of underselling the genre and the balance between the developers, what they can charge, and the players, what they will pay. And I think the problem we've run into a lot is this sort of soft-handed approach to game criticism, game reviews. This is my opinion, at least, where we pretty much tend to see most shmup reviews get recommendations. Very rarely do we see people being too harsh on shmups, unless it's myself, where, oh, this port is like the Psycho Zero Dev port's a perfect example of this, where I did my review for Nintendo Life. It was pretty controversial. People got mad at me, and I was pretty much the only person who gave that collection a negative review. And even people who are fans of my channel and fans of what I do, they're like, Mark, we get it. You know, it has a bunch of input lags. Yes, it's not accurate. Yes, it's bare bones, but they are great games in themselves. And I've always looked at this like, yes, the Psycho games are absolutely worth the money in themselves in another form that actually works, right? If they made a port of each game individually and charged you $40, but each game was done correctly and delivered what it was supposed to deliver, I would have no problem with that. So this is something a little bit different about me than maybe other types of reviewers, where I don't like to see collections all that often, because usually, now I'm not against collections on principle, like the Darius Cosmic collection is a great collection because it delivers by M2, but a lot of collections, what they sort of say is, well, we don't need to add value because we're going to add volume. And so like the Zero Div Psycho ports, again, a perfect example of this, where they give you a lot of volume, but they don't deliver as far as value and attention and care to the game. Actually, another one like this is the Pink Sweets Muchi Muchi Pork double pack, where when you compare it to the other 360 ports, now of course Pink Sweets and Muchi Muchi Pork are great games, that's not the issue. The issue is that, in my opinion, Cave were a little bit more lazy about these two ports as far as making sure they're really well done. They're a little bit more laggy than they should be. They don't have as much features as something like the Mushihime-sama port on the 360 or the Death Smiles port on the 360. They kind of went halfway as far as the quality, but they gave you two games. And I think in the end, this actually hurts those releases more than helps them, because if you're a big fan of Pink Sweets or you're a big fan of Muchi Muchi Pork, I think you would be better off paying for a full release of that game that gets the proper care and attention that it deserves, rather than doing that strange double pack that Cave decided to do. I think they did that for economic reasons, so I don't hold that against them too heavily. I can understand why they did that. But what I'm saying is that ideally, I would love to see a more attention-oriented release of those games at a full price rather than doing a double pack halfway there. And so that's one part about shmup pricing that I tend to always look towards. Isn't necessarily how fixed on the price tag am I. It's more about, is the game worth your time? And this is something that I don't think gets communicated too much in the is it worth it style review, because again, with enough time, with enough drops in sales, enough drop in prices, you can get real existential about it as far as what is bad, what is good, all that sort of stuff. But as far as the day-to-day practicality of whether or not a game is worth it for its price, I think the question you need to be asking is it worth it for your time? And this is another big problem that we see across game releases now, where a lot of reviewers tend to evaluate a game's monetary value through the amount of hours of original content it can provide you. There's actually an entire website dedicated to this, where it's like, how long is it or something like that. So Final Fantasy VII Remake comes out and you can look it up online and be like, oh, it's that long. That seems to justify the price tag. And a lot of reviewers do this. They'll look and say, oh, it's 20 hours of game time. That justifies the price tag. Oh, it's 60 hours of game time. That really justifies the price tag. Oh, it's 100 hours worth of game time. This is a big value. And I've talked about this in my gameplay density video, but for me, game time is not really a metric that matters all that much. Shmups are 40 minutes long. That's plenty of time, in my opinion, 20 to 40 minutes, depending on if it has loops and everything like that. And sometimes, in my opinion, games can be overly long because of this culture. Like Streets of Rage 4, I'd say the biggest flaw with Streets of Rage 4 is its length. It has too much filler. I think they did that to artificially make it more marketable to people who don't play the genre in the more hardcore sense, in the more score-oriented survival sense, just kind of more of a touristic expedition through the game. Then that extra filler maybe is worth it for them. But for me, the big problem with Streets of Rage 4 when it comes to its length is it's like a 2-hour game. If you're trying to grind out Mania no death runs or whatever you're doing, Mania Plus mode came out, for example, and Bogcog messaged me and says, hey, you're going to do Mania Plus? I'm like, yeah, at one point I'll get a Mania Plus 1cc. But the problem is it literally takes me 6 hours on a good day to get a 1cc in that game, because it takes a few tries and the game is so freaking long. It's insane how much time that takes up. And so for me, just throwing length onto a game can actually really damage it as far as its overall value in my eyes. It's all about how dense, how rich each moment of the game is. I've talked about this in my other gameplay density video, but I think it really matters when it comes to pricing, because this is, I think, the strongest argument for full price shmups that people don't make. People, again, like the M2 Shot Triggers ports come out, people will say, this is not worth a full price. This is not worth $60. This is not worth $40. It should be $20 like every other shmup, no matter what they do, because shmups are only an hour-long experience, and so they don't deserve to be as long. But I'm going to pull up my Ketsui log file here, and this is only part of the amount of time I've played Ketsui, because I've also played it in emulator over the years. But just look at how much time I've spent playing Ketsui on my PS4 port. It's getting up into the hundreds area, and I'm sure by the time I get my Emote 2 all, it will be in the 200, 300, 400, 500 hour territory. And I know Moglar has spent an insane, Moglar's about to get the world record in Ketsui, which is incredible. He's spent who knows how many, I think he showed me a screenshot, like thousands of hours in the game. So the question of is there hours of gameplay in these games is kind of silly. And it's not something that you can immediately tell just by looking at it on a website, right? You have to be able to play the game, you understand the depth of it. And I think that's a real big problem with this whole is it worth it mentality. So that's my thoughts on the more consumer side of things. I think shmups are undervalued. I think it creates a problem. The biggest perfect example of this is Crimson Clover World Explosion and World Ignition. So World Ignition on Steam has been undervalued to the point where you can't give away copies of it, and I'm not kidding. At one point when I was doing the podcast a few years ago, I thought to celebrate, it was like the 1 or 2 year anniversary of my podcast, I'm going to give out copies of Crimson Clover World Ignition to viewers, and I thought, this is such a cool idea. People are going to absolutely love this, and I bought a bunch of copies of it, and I can't remember exactly how I went about doing this, but I ended up buying a bunch of copies of Crimson Clover that I could gift to people, right? And so I went ahead to do that, and everyone who entered the contest and won already had a copy of Crimson Clover World Ignition, because the game has been frequently on sale for $2, 50 cents, $3. You know, it's been crazy cheap to get that game, and so basically every shmup fan already has it, which sounds good on paper, but the problem is when you get into trying to make money around the game, I don't know exactly how you're going to be able to do that, because you have a sort of finite supply of players, and if all of them are paying $2, but I've noticed it's not the case with Crimson Clover World Explosion on the Switch. So World Explosion on the Switch, because it's on the eShop and everything, I think is $20, somewhere in that range. And so the discrepancy between World Ignition on Steam being $2 and World Explosion on Switch being $20, when, I mean, World Explosion is a cool update, but it is an update at the end of the day, so it's not like this massive jump in value over World Ignition, and so it's this really funny dichotomy between them. And I actually don't know what the developer is going to do as far as when they bring Explosion to Steam. I'm assuming they're just going to bring it up to $20 to match Explosion, which is actually probably a better idea than selling it at $2. But this is something you see with shmups actually a lot. A lot of shmups are, the price point of shmups is not ever an issue, at least in my opinion. Most shmups you can get for very cheap prices, especially really good ones too. It's not even a huge problem. Price-wise, it's hard to find a genre more accessible in terms of spending money, where you can get excellent, amazing games for crazy cheap prices that will run on low-spec hardware. I mean, there's not a whole lot of barriers to playing the genre in that sense. You know, in the past, whenever you had console releases, like on the PS2 and everything, it was pretty rare to see something released for 20 bucks initially. You know, they'd come down to the greatest hits thing and be 20 bucks, but before then, they'd usually release around 40 or at the lowest 30. There's exceptions, but that's what I remember anyway. And so maybe if we can get that sort of pricing back for shmups where they can release at 20 and people will actually buy them at 20 rather than saying, well, I'll wait 3 years for it to drop to $10 or whatever. It's complicated. I'm not saying there's a one-size-fit-all solution here, but I do think that we tend to undervalue the genre and over-complain about the prices of things, especially stuff like the M2 Shot Triggers ports, which I think very easily earn their money's worth as far as being full price releases, especially when you start adding in features like online leaderboards. That adds so much value to a game, and that's not something you're going to get all that commonly, you know, and it does require some server maintenance and everything like that. So all those types of things really go a long way. Arranged modes, arranged soundtracks, all that stuff really goes a long ways towards justifying a full price tag, and of course the game being good and having great training options and everything like that. So let's end by talking about a fun little subject, which is the high rollers club of shmups. So we've talked about the consumer side of things where, you know, people are very careful about how much they will spend for a shmup. They tend to not really go full on for single shmup releases, and instead will prefer to wait for maybe lower quality collections to come out or something like that. There's that side of shmup pricing. And then there's the other side of shmup pricing, which is the high roller club, where now when you're spending money on shmups, you're not spending $100 on a shmup. You're not spending $200 on a shmup. No. You're spending thousands of dollars on a shmup because you're buying the PCBs, or you're buying extremely rare console ports like Radiant Silvergun on Saturn or something like that. And this is a really funny thing about shmups that make them really unique, actually, where the consumer side of them, I guess RPGs are kind of like this. The consumer side of them, people will be very stingy, But when you get into the collector side, the high roller club, then people are willing to drop money on this genre. It's a weird dichotomy. So you'll have people who will complain about Ketsui being $60 on the PS4, but then you'll have another sector of people who will gladly pay thousands of dollars to get the Ketsui PCB. I wish I could be a part of it. I wish I had the money behind me to drop thousands of dollars on PCBs. I love the idea of buying shmup PCBs and just dropping that money on them, but I just don't have the finances to make that happen. If I did, I would have an Exacab. I'd have all these cool PCBs that have Guange. I'd have especially DDP on PCB. I'd actually have that because then I could play in Japanese events and I could play at GDQ and everything and be allowed, because they don't allow emulation and Donpachi doesn't have a good console port right now. Batrider. I'd actually still play Gurega on the PS4, funnily enough, because I think the PS4 port of Gurega is just better than the PCB in every way. So I think that PCB I wouldn't really spend that much money on, but so many games I would love to have the PCBs for. And what's interesting when you talk about shmups and their pricing, I kind of look at these things as a combination of a piece of art, like a Mona Lisa, combined with a game like a chess, right? So if you shove the Mona Lisa into a chessboard, or I think that's kind of how I view shmups in the PCB side of things, is you're at one point you're buying an incredibly well-made game like Donpachi, but another part you're kind of buying like a art piece or something, like a collector's item that you can display and it aesthetically pleases you, and you get that sort of status in your mind of, yes, I'm in this higher status of a fan, right? There's the lowly consumer status people who will argue over whether a game's worth $20 or $30. And then there's the high rollers club where we argue, is the game worth $5,000 or $6,000? I really wish I could be part of that club of players. I just don't have the money for it. Maybe one day in the future. But I do think that part of the genre can get a little bit of a problem at times, because people were kind of against emulation and everything, saying, oh, emulation, that's bad, that's illegal. But there's no real solid ports, and so the answer is spend thousands of dollars on the PCBs. Kind of like the Japanese thing, actually, with Donpachi, where I'm not allowed to play Donpachi on emulator in their events, but I don't have the money to buy the Donpachi PCB, so I'm just kind of out of luck, right? And they do that for legal reasons, I understand. I do think shmup collecting is really interesting, and it is interesting because I think it's an entry point for a lot of people into the genre, but these people don't tend to stick around. And I've interviewed a lot of people who are collectors on my podcast earlier on, and a lot of them said that the way it went is they came in kind of hot and they bought all these PCBs up, and then over the years they kind of lost interest and then resold them or sold them off again. I think that's kind of a bit of an issue with shmups as far as accessibility, is that a lot of them tend to be like Radiant Silvergun on Saturn's a great example of this. Fantastic game. I just did a 1cc commentary of it, actually. I've had a ton of fun playing that game. I recommend it to everyone, and especially the Saturn port itself. While it should have more training features as far as the way it runs, the way it works, it's still the best way to play the game as far as performance and everything like that. But the problem is if you want to play it, you either need to do some fun stuff with your Sega Saturn, like I did, or you need to spend how much money on the official CD, right? This is an issue where people want to play Radiant Silvergun, but it's just not feasibly possible. And I remember in the past some people would say, oh, I will never play a shmup that's not officially made and everything like that. And so it gets a little bit complicated there too, where people can get priced out of certain releases because of just the scarcity and the collectability of them. And then there are people who have these games that don't really care about them all that much, are more interested in Saturn collecting. Like I remember listening to video game collecting stuff in the past, and they talk about these games and say, oh wow, I got this game, I got Radiant Silvergun, I got that game. But they weren't really fans of the genre at all. It was just the fact that they were rare and scarce because shmups. But there's a mystique about them that makes them extremely collectible. And I do think that's a little bit of a shame. And I'd love to see one day Treasure Contact Limited run, and they're like, okay, let's print 5,000 or 10,000 copies of Radiant Silvergun and sell them for like $60 or something. That would be really cool. I don't think we're going to see that anytime soon, but if people start doing that and making money on it, it can kind of become a bit of a trend. So I'm never say never, right? And so yes, that's everything I have to say about shmup pricing. I hope you all enjoyed this video. In summary, whenever I'm evaluating a shmup, I'm looking at the overall quality of the release and not trying to dwell too much on the numbers, because in my opinion, if a shmup is well done, if a shmup has all the features you need, the price points, I think at 60 and above, if it's a really good game, can be justified, and if it's a fairly good game, can be justified, just like any other genre at around the $20 range. I think that's perfectly fine. 40, 20. I think people are a little bit too harsh on shmup pricing. They tend to get undervalued because a lot of people just view shmups as McDonald's mobile style games that are just pick up and play for an hour and then you never play them again. So they should only be $7 or $5, which I deeply disagree with, and pour one out for the poor Psycho collection. Hopefully one day we get a proper Psycho collection and the games get the love they deserve. Adios, everyone. So thank you to the $5 patrons: 72 PCT Water, Adam Pearson, Ukshay Wadker, Dingo, Andy Cap, Another Joe, Anthony A, Aaron Solis, Ben, Borgie22, Brian Reboot, Brian Shiver, Chris Yuzefovich, Chronic Burnout 3, Choreo, CRC Error, Danielle Savage, Darren Griffin, Delta Tango 6, Disco Star Slayer, Eric H, Frank Carter, Full Set, Roger Schmupper, Geriatric, Don Maku, Hal Su, Ilya, Kiwi, JLab, JB RPG, Joe Angelo, John Kelly, Gameboy Guru, K, K2, Kiko Man 589, Larridge, Malaise, Mark Toms, Maz, Minung, Mechalin, Queen Charlene, Nathaniel Davis, and Electron, Neon Dagger Games, Okla Kugels, Philip Mason, Portal 63, Raul, Real Skeen, Sketchy Raccoon, SLW, The Boot Rex, The Real Ikuzo, TRM, Sugumo, Yishi, Plasmo, and Utsukaya. Thanks for watching.